just letting you know how I got to know Shayan. Shayan has been a fellow friend from JNU, and later on we have been colleagues. And he's my go-to person whenever I'm stuck with any kind of critical writing issues or teaching anything. He always has some interesting, innovative ideas to kind of play around with. And today I've invited him, and he's very generously agreed to do this on a very short notice, going up and down the timeline with his very, very busy schedule on something to discuss about something which is quite his niche. So peer feedback, peer review is something that he has been working for a very long time, experimenting with different processes, unpacking the problems and challenges that this particular and very, very important component of writing brings onto the table, and why feedback itself is kind of something we want for our writing, but then we are very skeptical to hear about and how to deal with it, right? So we know our writing needs feedback, but we possibly don't know how to accept it or how to kind of go about it. So that's why Shayan is here, and thank you very much, Shayan, for doing this. And on the other note, Shayan is also a musician. You can see the guitars behind. So as I said, he's very playful in his classes and brings in all kinds of things into his teaching. And that's what makes him a great teacher. So let's see what we can learn. And I'm thankful to my community in the Logos Lab. Many of us are here today. Hopefully we'll have a very engaging session. The format is a workshop format, so please respond to Shayan's questions when he comes up with asking something. That will take the session forward quickly. And yeah, so I hand over to Kiran for the formal introduction, because my voice will possibly not take any further. I'll be here, but yeah, so also just an introduction for Kiran. Kiran is an integral part of Logos Lab. She's a team member. She takes care of the running of Logos Lab equally with me. So she has been an absolute delight to work with as a friend and as a peer. And she's an equally and absolute enthusiast about learning about reading and writing. So she's taken workshops in Logos Lab as well. And so that's Kiran for you. So thank you so much, everyone who's joined. And yeah.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Polumidi. And yeah, I've also I'm learning constantly, and I'm really looking forward to today's workshop. But before we begin that, I'll give a short introduction of Shayan. So Shayan teaches a course titled Education, Literacy and Justice at the Critical Writing Program in the Young India Fellowship, Ashoka University. He's engaged with the fields of critical pedagogy, emotions in education, and critical university studies. He's also a co-curator of AINA, which is a social media page you can find on Instagram @AAINA_EDU. I'll share the link later in the chat box. It's a social media initiative to encourage reflection on educational experiences among students, teachers, and anyone interested in the question of education. It's a fantastic page. I've been following it after Polumidi recommended, and they have very interesting comics with lots of different themes being covered. So go check it out after the workshop. What today's workshop is going to be about is peer feedback, and I think it's relevant to all of us. It's an integral part of, as Polumidi mentioned, about how we go about writing. But there's so much. I think one thing I really wanted to voice, which happened to me as I've just come back from an academic conference. So we want feedback because we want to make our writing better. But what I also realized with myself, and I guess happens with everyone, you're always one step behind. Let me make my writing a little bit more better before I give it to feedback. So, but it will only become better after you get a feedback. It's kind of a catch-22, because I realized I was so scared of sending my conference draft to these senior professors who were part of my panel. It's a scary process because you're will they judge me for my work, or I don't know what they'll think of me, and all of those questions. So I think I'll get some of those answers today. One of the themes we are going to look at is how do we navigate power dynamics in peer groups? Not even when we are getting feedback from our formal supervisors or senior academicians, but also even just in the space of the university or maybe outside of it. Like Logos Lab is a community where people have been sharing their work with each other. There's always this dynamics of seniority, some kind of hierarchy, and how do we navigate that? How do peer conversation shapes one's authorial voice is another theme is we are going to look at, because our ideas get framed constantly based on the conversations we have with our peers. And how does that influence our work? How do we see that? I think that's one question. Is again, we have discussed before, but of citation, how do we cite conversations? That's something Polomidi has been talking about again and again. If like there's an idea which came up with a friend, and it's our actually a duty and honest practice to cite that. I have done that for this paper and have learned that from both Polomidi. And another important theme is how do we work through the experience of vulnerability in peer work? Again, just the theme I started with, because it's scary to share one's writing. I don't know if it's like when you are more senior in and once you get more things out, you're more confident of your writing. How is it? I would like to know from people here who have published, who have like done more work. For me, when I'm just starting out with my writing, no publications yet, it's scary. It's just very scary. And and how do we develop and evaluate meaningful peer feedback practices? Like this is just again so important. How do we go about asking questions? And so I've received feedbacks like your writing is good. And like what does that mean? Like how do I know like what is good and how do I make it better? So this time when I sent my paper to a couple of professors, I actually had 3-4 pointed questions. Again, all thanks to Palmiti, because I asked like, this is what I want to do, and this is what do you think about this? And another important thing is, which see, I would actually like you to highlight, Shayan, is there's this constant fear of getting our ideas stolen also, which I've seen. Like I try to build this kind of community in my center in JNU. We are 5-6 people, but I see this like even when right now people sharing their synopsis, there's like so much fear that someone might, and when this is such an initial stage, people are very afraid of sharing the draft completely in writing, though they are okay talking about their ideas. And this fear I've seen, because I've seen people advising me that don't you go very easily about sharing your drafts, like you never know if someone copies it. So how do we deal with that? How do we create a safe space? And is this fear like, how much is it really important, or is it just because I feel maybe it's not that important, because eventually the ideas change and develop, and even if someone took that one, I can come up with something else. I don't know how to navigate that. The last and like and I think we covered that. So how to build trust and foster care driven feedback processes. So how do we take care of these things? And reading and giving review again is a very draining task. It takes a lot of effort and work. So you, both of you, and many of you, like I think people here are in that space where they are teaching students to read and write, to read someone's writing, and it's a lot of work. And how do we make people do that? Actually, when we are trying to build this community, what I've seen is people are just like, it's difficult to make them engage constantly with each other's work, because everyone is so much busy with their own reading and writing. So how do we build together? And how do I would like to do something, I'm like thinking of doing something of this sort in my center. But yeah, I think this will be a nice place to learn how to go about doing that. So yeah, that's where I think I'll give the mic to Shayan to start with the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiran. I think you've anticipated a lot of the ideas, and we'll work through them. And I think it would be useful, perhaps, to keep some time at the end to just address questions separately too, because I think you asked a cluster of questions, and I think all of them, require separate attention. And thank you so much, Polumi, for inviting me, and also for curating the sort of this community of people engaged with writing. And uh, and just to sort of again reinforce what both Polumi and Kiran have said, that today's session is of course going to be on peer feedback, but it is happening in a sort of interactive way, because I don't think anybody on their own can arrive at what are determinate or essential peer feedback practices. It is something that we're constantly negotiating. And in fact, what I'm looking forward to is hearing you, but also perhaps hearing differences from how I have been approaching peer feedback. Because in my own journey of engaging in peer feedback and also teaching and talking about peer feedback with students, there have been some shifts that have happened, and it is a continuous sort of process of reflection through which we kind of engage with peer feedback, right? So it would be great to sort of hear from all of you, and I'll have questions and prompts at different points. Also, if possible, it would be great to have some videos on too, because it sort of helps me engage with all of you. So if that's possible, do turn on your videos. Now, before we get into the questions on peer feedback, I just wanted to, talk about a couple of conceptual premises, right, for this conversation. One is to think of what writing, like what do we mean by writing, and why is peer feedback integral to sort of developing, honing, nurturing, our writing. And the second conceptual premise is to think of what do we understand by community, right? And in this case, we're thinking of community vis-a-vis writing. What does it mean to have a writing community, right? Now, I want to sort of put down a couple of quotes from the reading that I had shared, and I hope some of you have, or all of you have gone through it. So this is one. Can everyone read it? Right? And I'll put down the second quote. I'm putting it down on chat. Yeah.
It's in the chat box.
Yeah, it's in the chat box, but I'll also read it out. So first, how do we think of writing? And I am assuming that, if you have been engaging with these sessions, then you are already thinking of writing as a community-driven practice or a community-mediated practice, right? And I think for those who, are joining for the first time, I think it's important to think of how in any academic setting, there is a particular ideology of writing within which we are positioning ourselves and learning how to write and learning various writing practices, right? So the fears, anxieties, attitudes that we are developing is in relation to a certain ideology of writing that already exists. Now, one of the sort of important shifts that have happened within the study of writing and literacy, right, over the past, let's say, 2 or 3 decades in particular, is that we are moving away from, let's say, a more individual-centric idea of writing to a more community or social idea of writing. That how we learn to write in an academic setting is not happening, through some individual cognitive acquisition, right? It's not that, I read a textbook and I sort of learn what these practices are, or I look at a plagiarism manual and I understand. Instead, it's happening through conversation, it's happening through classroom practices, right? And it is important to identify, what are the ways in which that is happening. Now, this quote is saying that this reading that I shared, it looks at writing as intensely social, emotional, and personal, as well as formal and public, involving dynamics of fear and desire, as well as intellectual understanding and skill development. And I think each of these words are very important for us, right? That as we are writing, we are engaging with social discourse, we are writing for people, we are taking things from people and putting them in our writing. So it is inherently social, right? It is also emotional. And I think, we have, unfortunately, this view of academic writing as detached, disinterested, but academic writing is also intensely emotional, right? I do this exercise in class sometimes where, I'll ask students to look at, let's say, a reading and say, okay, what is the tone? And they'll say, oh, it's a bit detached. I'll say, okay, let's look at 3 sentences and look at each fragment. You will notice a plethora of emotions, from sarcasm to assertion to, curiosity, right? Because that is an inherent feature of how you're using language, right? So it is emotional, but it's also emotional in the sense of how we are emotional beings who are bringing our emotions into writing, right? We are, let's say, feeling anxiety while writing. We may be feeling, joy while writing. We may be feeling, different kinds of negative, positive, or mixed emotions while writing. And personal, right? it is something that is helping sort of us shape particular thought processes and particular ways of being even, right? And it's also helping us position ourselves vis-a-vis a discipline, a book, a text, right? Or whatever, a social ideology. um, so I think that it's important to sort of start from this slightly more broader or comprehensive sort of view of writing. But let's move to the next conceptual premise, which is to think of community, right? The the essay points out that when we engage in a community practice of writing, there are at the very least two ways in which we are writing. We are writing in and writing out. What that means is that when we sit together and we are giving sort of informal or formal feedback to each other, where we are commenting on each other's writing, where we are ideating, because often the conversation on writing is not that, oh, this is good and this is bad, but what do you think of this? You take a phrase and you ask, but I feel maybe a different word could have been useful, right? So this form of dialogue, and in a sense an experimental dialogue, is what is writing in, right? It is a mechanism for experimentation in text and in dialogue over the text, right? So you have a text and you're writing in it, you're rewriting in it also, right? At the same time, as the to quote, what is at stake is learning how to write out for broader scholarly communities, positioning the unfolding dissertation text in ways that navigate and project a certain kind of writerly self. Now, this is also another way in which, to write is, especially to write within academic settings, is communitarian, because when we are sort of picking up cues from others, that's happening within a particular, let's say, intellectual or disciplinary discourse, right? So, how is it that some people are arriving at these notions of what is writing in history versus what is writing in anthropology versus what is writing in the sciences, right? They're not always spelled out very clearly. It's not that the format is made explicit to us, right? But through conversations and through imagined understandings even of who we are writing for, and what is the tone we need to adapt, what is the form in which we need to use sort of evidence, what are the ways in which we need to sort of argue, right? All of these questions are happening through either a real kind of interaction with the disciplinary community or an imagined understanding of what the community entails, right? Now, with these conceptual premises in mind, we will get into sort of the more, reflective questions. Now, the first thing that I thought we could talk about is the idea of power dynamic in peer feedback practices. But before that, I just want to get a sense of how many of you regularly engage with peer feedback in any capacity, either in terms of giving feedback to others, getting feedback from others, and this would depend on where you are, in your academic career, right? Whether you're a student or a teacher, the kind of experience you've had. But I would love to get a sense. So, is everyone here part of some sort of peer feedback practice? Like, have you given or received peer feedback?
I have both given and received
Okay.
peer feedback. It was like trained. I am trained in giving and receiving peer feedback. Actually, I'm doing my PhD, and in our academic writing class, our course instructor, Dr. Monishita Hajra Pandey, she taught us how to give and receive peer feedback. So we had a specific session on that. So
Okay.
now we are very familiar with doing this, even informal.
Okay. Great. Great. Um, is there anybody here who hasn't engaged at all in peer feedback practice? Okay. So I'm assuming that everyone has then. Yeah. Jitendra, you want to say something? Or Dr. Ruchika?
Shayan, I think you could kind of just introduce briefly what the process is, because people might be not willing to talk, but I'm not sure if everyone here knows about peer feedback. So just
Okay. So
introductory.
at a very sort of basic level, so have you got comments on your writing, or have you discussed your writing with a peer, right, with another person, um, who is, let's say, your colleague or your fellow student? Okay. Now, I think, like, okay, let's sort of then establish, what peer feedback is, and then we can move on. Now, I want to sort of also distinguish between peer feedback and what we are thinking, what we sort of usually call a peer review, right? Or a formal institutionalized peer review. Now, the similarity in both is that you're getting comments on your writing, right? However, what we are engaged with is peer feedback, which is happening in a much more direct capacity, right? It's happening within sort of community settings to which you have access, right? It is more personalized, right? And it may happen in a one-on-one setting, or it may also happen in a group setting. Whereas a peer review, so we kind of publish in peer reviewed journals, where whatever work is being published would be reviewed by a scholar from that discipline, right, or from that field. And these are anonymous sort of reviews. You don't necessarily know who the scholar is, but you sort of get feedback on how to improve sort of your writing. We are not talking about that, because that usually is happening anyway at an advanced stage. Um, and also, even, let's say, there are many people here or many people in sort of Indian university settings who would be publishing in peer reviewed journals, but are not necessarily participating in very everyday institutional peer feedback practices. So our focus is on peer feedback practices, right? So peer feedback practice, as I said, would simply sort of mean, receiving and giving comments on each other's writing, right? So it is feedbacking on each other's writing. Now, I also want to clarify here a distinction between, let's say, formal and informal feedback, right? So let's say, and this is, what we read in the literature on assessment, right? So the most informal feedback would just be a stray response, right? Where this can often happen in classroom settings, where you are let's say the teacher or a peer, right, will just say something. Oh, I didn't like this piece of writing, or I thought this was a bit unstructured, I thought this is a bit weak, right? So this would be sort of an informal kind of feedback, which is more often than not presented as an opinion, right, on writing. And you can sort of use it as a way to build a conversation then. Oh, what is it that you don't like, and so on and so forth, right? um, and at the other end of the pole, we have formal feedback, which typically happens in a written sort of format, right? Or in a more organized format, right? So it's not that, written and verbal can't happen together. Of course, formal and informal come together often, and we'll also talk about that. But in a sort of formal sort of setting, what we have is, we would have like very sort of precise comments, right, on your writing, right, which will be written down. And towards the end of the session, we'll also talk about how to kind of, sort of shape sort of our comments, especially when it comes to formal feedback, right? Kiran, you wanted to say something? Sorry, your hand was raised.
Yeah, I just want to ask, like, this peer feedback, does it also includes the feedback from our supervisors? Because that's one way, but that's, I think, an important part of the PhD process. Like, I'm not going to, but my work is constantly getting reviewed by my supervisor. So are we talking about that also, or only about when we are engaging with our friends or colleagues?
We're talking about the latter primarily. I mean, of course, feedback practices apply to even sort of the supervisor-student, relation. And I think what we'll talk about today, they would apply to other sort of scenarios, where, let's say, a supervisor is giving you feedback, or whatever, a teacher is giving feedback to a student, right? Or a more experienced or senior scholar is giving feedback to a junior scholar. Even there, I think some of the elements we'll talk about apply in terms of how should we give feedback, right? But I think what we are talking about today is peer feedback practices, where basically you are giving and receiving feedback from your peers, so somebody who is roughly at the same level as you in terms of being a student, a scholar in the field, right? So that, all right. Now, um, the first question I have, since I mean, many of you, I'm not sure if you have engaged with the essay, but the essay talks about how when a bunch of students, come together, the essay is set in sort of a context where you have some doctoral students who come together, and they are reading each other's writing, right, and sort of providing comments to each other. So the first question I have for all of you is, what are your sort of first impressions or emotions when you engage in, let's say, a peer feedback practice, right? So when, let's say, when you're part of a peer group and you are exchanging your ideas or showing your writing, what are some of the first emotions, impressions, thoughts, feelings that you have? And from here, we'll sort of try to get into the question of power dynamics in peer feedback. So this is a more open question. So yeah, can we have some responses?
Can I go? I think
Yeah.
people can also, yeah, people are Paulmidi. Yes. I think, yeah, I agree with you, Paulmidi. Anxiety. Yeah, anxiety is the first one. Fear, again, which is kind of related to the anxiety, because what they will think of me. Because will they think that I'm not a good enough scholar because I can't write nicely? Yeah, yeah, that's it. I think it's fear and anxiety mostly.
Okay. Um, whether person, I think we have another one, that whether the person receiving feedback would take it positively. So this is more about how you give feedback to another person, and yeah, like whether they'll be able to kind of receive it in a meaningful, positive, effective way. What else? Okay, so Alina, could you sort of explain this if possible? So
Yeah,
what
sure.
yeah, yeah.
I'm so sorry. Is it all right if I don't open my camera?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this is something that we were introduced to back in university, and I think the positivity which I attached to the peer feedback session is because of my course instructors. You know, when they introduced this concept in the class, in the beginning, all of us, I think, had this fear of being judged. We were anxious of sharing our work publicly. Of course, that's a lot of pressure, right? But then when she was introducing us this concept in the class, what she did was she started with pair work. She paired us with one person, and that person was supposed to be our buddy. And everything that we submitted in the class, we could first share with that one person. So we kind of grew to lean on each other for feedback, for gaining confidence. If you approve, I think my work is good enough to present to the rest of the class. Then from pair work, we moved to groups of 4 or 5, right? Our like spectrum of comfort expanded. Then we had group peer sessions in the classroom. We became such good friends across the whole course that even after the course ended, we continued this practice. And whenever now we have to submit a paper or send in an abstract, we WhatsApp each other our writings and get feedback from each other. If we have enough time, we kind of sit through with the writing over Zoom. We share our screens and we make comments. But if that's not possible, even WhatsApp messages sending in, okay, in paragraph 3 you lost your tone, or this writing doesn't fit your argument very well. You might give it in the references, but do not mention it here. Small things like that, they kind of make me more confident when I'm presenting to experts in the field. Like, at least my people, my peers support what I'm doing. They agree that this is good enough. So now I can move to the next level.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Alina, and that's great. But if I may ask sort of a counter question also,
Yes.
uh, that when, let's say, you sort of expand the group, let's say, from, let's say, group from just pair work to, let's say, having 4 people, uh,
Right.
do you also have to then navigate differences in approach or power dynamics in that who's asserting more or not asserting, or does that problem not come up at all?
Oh, no, it does. I mean, as soon as you have to interact with the new person, it takes a bit of time to build a rapport. I
Hmm.
mean, with
One-on-one, I think in 2 or 3 sessions, we were good to go. But when we moved on to a group, initially, like three of us were more comfortable with each other, then four, then five, we grew little by little. And one thing that really helped navigate that space was having, initially, when our instructor was helping us become comfortable with the idea, what she did was she suggested that we might want to have some headers on which we comment. Using which comment on the writing, for example tone, for example references, for example the argumentative power, so if you have headers like that, it's easier to tell your opinion or share feedback, and not feel that, oh no, I don't know how this feedback is coming in, or I don't know how my feedback is being received. So it kind of helps us expect those things from each other and not get offended or disrupt dynamics in the group, but it takes its sweet time.
Yeah, that's actually quite useful. Thanks, Alina. Jitendra, I think you've said something about how do you explain our sentence. Could you explain that? I don't know if you can talk though, Jitendra. You said you're in a library, but could you explain this? Okay, can't hear you, Jitendra, in case you're talking. But I think, yeah, so maybe, I mean, I think what you broadly possibly mean is how do you explain the thought process behind your sentence, or, and again, like maybe this is connected to what Polumi also said, that rather than my ideas, will the way I use English matter more to my peer, right? So again, this is a sort of common assumption or bias, and it's real. It does happen, right? Where um, you feel like you're being judged for your language, and especially when you're aware that the other person perhaps uses language in a way that where they have more control over syntax, or sort of they're using more qualified or more complex sentences, and you feel, oh, my sentences are too simple. And in fact, one of the examples used in the essay was exactly that, right? Where you had a bunch of students where one student used shorter, simpler sentences or more lucid writing, and he's thought that, oh, I feel like it's too lucid, it's too basic. And immediately the other sort of peer said that, no, no, but you're able to explain your ideas very well. But often we feel this sort of anxiety, right? That, oh, it's not sounding smart enough. And you also feel like, oh, but you're being judged for the language and not the ideas, right? Okay, now I think what I sort of want to I want to pause, and what I want to like highlight here is to talk about sort of power dynamics, and how do we kind of think about power dynamics a little more concretely, right? So I'm just going to copy paste something on the chat box, right? Um, and I want to sort of identify certain elements that we can think about and keep in mind as we're navigating power dynamics. Now, the first thing is that there will be a power dynamic, right, in any peer setting, and the power dynamic can depend on what existing or prior experience one has had in reading and writing. It can depend on the way one is able to express themselves, with what kinds of confidence are they able to express themselves. It will depend on, so I mean, and those of course would be more linguistic factors, right, which will shape the power dynamic. But it can also depend on a status that one has within a, let's say, a classroom community or a scholarly community, right? Where, and sometimes there are, especially when it comes to cross-disciplinary peer feedback, often there are these anxieties of how there's this hierarchy of disciplines, and you feel like, oh, like I am an English student talking to a history student, and or whatever, and you might feel that, oh, you perhaps have more rigor in how you're sort of approaching a piece, and I don't know how to do that necessarily. So there will be also certain skill sets that one has and the other may not have, right? So there will be strengths and weaknesses that each peer is coming with. Now, I think that one of the essential things to keep in mind is that there are different roles we're playing in a peer feedback setting, and it's important to sort of clarify that role. Now, in a classroom community, right, when let's say I have 5 different people responding to a text, I would sort of identify that, okay, look, some of you are better able to comment on, let's say, the language. Some of you are better able to comment on the kind of evidence that is being used. Some of you may be better able to comment on the content argument because of your reading. So based on your existing capacities, strengths, knowledges, your roles can be clarified, right? Each person is bringing something to the table, right? But on the other hand, each person has something to learn from their peer. So I feel like clarifying roles, clarifying styles in which people give feedback, become really useful in such a scenario. Second, and this is connected, how do we identify differences, but also build a conversation, through that difference? And this is, while identifying differences is easier, where I can say that, okay, I have read this text, and Paulomi, you have read that text. I am more interested in literary studies. You're more interested in political studies, right? We can identify those differences, but building a conversation is difficult because that's where we have to, in some sense, let go of our defenses and also anxieties, right? And that becomes a difficult bit. And I think what one useful thing to reflect on is, in any peer setting, think about like, how are you feeling about it? Do you feel like you have the upper hand in that situation, or do you feel like you are like you're feeling a little anxious or intimidated? Do you have power over the other person, or do you think the other person has power over you? And I think that sort of reflection will then help you think of, okay, what do I need to work on? What defenses do I need to let go of, right? The other thing is, and this happens in sort of larger, I would say, communities. So let's say if, the people on this call, we were to now develop a peer feedback community, what would happen is some subgroups begin developing too, right? Or what you would call sort of, there are power blocks that also develop within a community. We know this happens in a classroom. We know that, okay, even though, maybe there are 20, 30 people in a class, but it feels like there are 3 people who are having their internal conversation, and the others are feeling a bit excluded from it. So this is again something that ends up happening in peer feedback sort of settings when these are bigger kind of groups. I have noticed this often in my classrooms, where if, let's say, we have a group of 3, and the maximum I usually would have is 3 in a group. If a couple of them are friends, there's a great chance of the third person feeling a bit excluded, right? Unless they kind of begin by being conscious of it, and then consciously including the third person, right? And not necessarily going into these internal conversations, which makes the other person feel like, oh, they don't know much, right? So, and the final thing, I mean, when I say negotiating power, I think I already sort of addressed it. What I mean is that you reflect on whether you have power over or the other person has power over you, right? And then think that, okay, what do I need to do in that situation? Now, perhaps in a bit, maybe if you share experiences, I think we can sort of concretely address it. Because it is, for me, it is easier to talk about what do you do when you have power over someone. Because I'm also thinking of myself more in the capacity of a teacher, and that's the setting in which I'm giving feedback primarily, right? And in that situation, I think something as simple as asking questions or giving suggestions, right, rather than giving sort of an authoritative comment, becomes a very useful tool, right? Some things, for example, I'd say, okay, I feel this. What do you think? Right? Just sort of asking that question is now giving the other person the agency to sort of now reflect and speak back, right? And what you are doing then, and you're not doing it in a patronizing way, you're trying to do it in a way where you are curious about what they have to say, right? How you also negotiate having power over is, to go back to what Polomi said, that you are consciously thinking of unlearning your own biases. So it's like you're starting by thinking that, okay, I may have certain biases about language. If the first thing that strikes your mind is that the comma is in the wrong place, or that, oh, I don't like this word, right? If the first response is aesthetic, then there is a great chance again that you really need to examine your biases and think that, okay, wait, maybe I should look at other pieces of the writing. Now, one thing that helps you there is again asking the person, what is your intention? What are you trying to say? This is again a peer feedback practice that I often use in my classroom settings, where I say that okay, you have 3 people in a group, or even if there are 2 people in a group, first read the person's writing, but then let the person say what they intended to do, because often intention is not equivalent to what comes out, right? So before you give your comments, understand the intention, because then you can sort of really begin to see that, okay, oh, this is why they're using this concept, or this is why they're framing the argument in a particular way, right? And perhaps, yes, perhaps everyone is failing to realize their intention. None of us are able to fully realize their intention. But if you understand the intention, then you can also give very specific feedback and you can sort of be genuinely helpful in that situation, right? All right. Now, I'll move to the next sort of question, and I sort of put down the question first, and we'll take some responses. And this is a connected question, right?
Shayan, I think Jitendra has explained himself a little bit in the chat. So if you want to read it.
Okay, so I think what you're talking about in a sense connects to what I'm asking, which is, you're saying that, you're writing and you're thinking, oh, am I right or wrong? You are feeling unsure about your own writing as you're writing, right? And that sense of unsurety or uncertainty is affecting the production, right? You feel like, okay, maybe I'm missing out on things. Maybe I'm not able to say this idea sharply enough, right? And often that unsurety even paralyzes you, right? It blocks you from sort of writing and completing your project. And this is something that so many people talk about, especially sort of early stage researchers who have writer's block or just this paralyzing anxiety about putting it out. And of course, that is, a situation where somebody seems to have power over you. And this somebody may be even intangible. It's not that, somebody is directly judging you, but you just feel like, okay, my writing is not good enough in that imagined community you have of writers, right? So how do you work through this? So the next question I have, and perhaps we can all reflect on this, how do we work through vulnerability in peer work? Because this is a state of being vulnerable, right? Where you feel that, okay, I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm good enough. You're feeling, if somebody now judges you, you will feel a little hurt even, right? Because you're not sure, because you feel it's not developed. And again, it is also connected to your sense of self-esteem as a student, as a scholar. It is connected to the kind of status accorded to you within a classroom community or a disciplinary community. So there are sociological factors, for this too, along with psychological. So let's think of this a little more. How do we work through vulnerability in peer work? So if anybody would like to share your own experiences of feeling vulnerable.
Shayan, if I just can share something to trigger, I think vulnerability is a big thing when you're sharing your work, particularly writing, because sometimes, as you said, writing, no matter how academic, it tends to become emotional and personal, more often than we would agree it becoming, right? So when it's that, sharing that becomes kind of sharing a part of yourself. And that is something that people might not feel comfortable doing in situations where you do not know how the person reading it would make meaning out of it, or as Alina mentioned, the word judgment. Because there are other things that get affected. In a classroom situation, the other person getting to know what my internal thought processes are might actually affect the way friendships build up in classroom spaces. So getting to know some parts of that person might actually affect the other parts which are unrelated, but then they will eventually get affected, right? Yeah. So I remember you are not very keen on bringing in the word friend, but then for me, I guess, as Alina said, initially there are some kind of problems, some kind of struggles gelling with the person, but eventually you end up becoming a confidant in each other, where you can say upfront when things don't work. And that's the relationship we want with a pair where feedback works. So I guess creating that safe space consciously is very important, and that's very difficult also. It's important. It's very difficult. Uh, Even as teachers, in spite of giving certain directives right in the beginning of our courses and continuously reinforcing it when we do this peer feedback exercises, I guess still um, there are places where there are cracks in the safe space. Sometimes as a teacher, we can perceive it happening right in front of our eyes. So how do we tackle it in situations like that? So yeah, my way of working through vulnerability is definitely putting down certain directives in place right at the beginning. But also when you see cracks happening within the process, I guess segregating the people who are involved in that and then talking to them personally is like, what's not working? If it's working for the rest of the class, why it's not working for you too? Where is the problem? I think that is one way in which I work through vulnerability. As for me, if I engage with someone, I make sure that's a safe space. Because by now we know that, okay, these are the people which give us that cocoon where you can be blunt, you can be honest, but you will still give me the needed advice. So as of now, that's the maturity that has come. But honestly, with students, you won't get that space all the time. So how do you detect that safe space or create that safe space also becomes very important.
Yeah. Can we have more responses?
Yeah, I guess people can speak up now that you've been warmed enough. Even if
speaking is also, I mean, an act of negotiating vulnerability.
Exactly.
And yeah, but we can sort of, I'm hoping I'll get to hear more of you maybe a few minutes down then. And in that, it's not that you have to answer the question immediately. We can come back to this question also, and whatever you would want to share. Because I feel like there's a lot to learn, from each other when we share these experiences, given it is something that just internally festers often. But I think, from what Polumi and Kiran said, I think, yeah, I think there are two sort of levels at which we can think of negotiating vulnerability, right? One would be to just sort of negotiate the act of sharing your thought with another, and how that is happening in this sort of formal setting where there's something more at stake, right? Because you are going to be evaluated for it, right? This is your work. This is not just a straight thought, but sort of a work that you are putting down, and which has a legitimacy within the institution. And then when you share that work with somebody, you're opening yourself up to judgment. You're also opening yourself up to scrutiny of your thought process, which is so intimate to you, right? And you don't want to reveal that intimate part of you. But and often, sometimes I feel like it's interesting that we feel anxious about academic writing, because academic writing itself can be a disguise. Academic writing often gives you the tools to hide your real thoughts and use, let's say, a slightly more distantiated kind of language with which to kind of talk about ideas. You can talk about ideas in broad strokes, in theoretical terms, and not really reveal your experiential or moral kind of understandings, right? But even with academic language, we feel that vulnerability, which is quite interesting. It's also vulnerability about being judged for not being good enough, not being smart enough. And that, of course, is shaped through institutional cultures which have consolidated over decades and centuries. I mean, of course, in the modern sort of university context, it's not too long, but we have inherited a system which is deeply hierarchical, right? And in that system, we are constantly negotiating power, we are constantly internalizing hierarchies, and thus we will feel sort of intimidated and judged for not being good enough, right? But in sort of the act of revealing yourself, as Paulumi said, you open up the possibility of, friendship. But even if it's not friendship, you open up the possibility of a very honest kind of exchange. Now, what at the same time needs to happen is that we have to develop a vocabulary to help specifically respond to each other's writing or thought process, right? And we'll come to this, when we talk about peer feedback practices. But the problem is that, let's say I share my writing with you and you tell me something very generic, however empathetic you are. You say that, this feels a bit incoherent. What do I do with that, right? And often that's where the problem is. We don't have a vocabulary to provide a feedback that is attuned or that is in tune or very sensitively kind of connected to the thought process. And that means that we have to spend a little more time with the writing we are engaging with, right? Again, there's a difference when we are doing it one-on-one, sitting together, because there, as I said a little before, you get a sense of the person's intention. The person can really talk, through their thought process, and it helps you understand their writing. But in a written kind of context, while you don't understand the context, but it's important to imagine that, okay, there is a complex thought process at work here. And even if the writing to you, the sentence doesn't feel new to you, you have heard the sentence before, for this person, there is a thought process, and you are trying to actually help the person reflect on that thought process. You want to build a conversation on that thought process. So I feel like that kind of assumption is really helpful, right? Knowing that there's a complex thought process, and thus you doing the work to develop a much more refined vocabulary. The other thing, what Kiran was talking about is also interesting, which is how, feeling vulnerable when you share content, right? And here the anxiety is not about writing and how you'll be judged for your sentences and your vocabulary, but how is your content being judged? And because the content gets associated with your position as a scholar and also with your identity. And of course, when you have a space where labels are being used very reductively and where people are looking to slot you, you feel insecure, or you feel vulnerable. You feel like, okay, I won't be able to say this because then people will judge me for, for being whatever, XYZ identity. But I feel like in a peer feedback group, it is sometimes useful to also discuss this as a problem, right? I think before or even after or in between, engaging with each other's writing, perhaps we can discuss this as a problem that, okay, do we have existing ideological positions? And so when we talk about intention, we're also talking about ideological intention or approach. Sometimes you are confused, sometimes you are, unclear about where you are at. Your writing may seem more authoritative, but actually, ethically or conceptually, you're not as clear, right? And saying that helps, because then one feedback you can get is that then, why do you have to sound so authoritative? Right? And this is often a feedback I give to my students, because when I read their writing, they would have said something very, strong. And I would say that, do you actually think like this? And they'll be like, actually, no, So there is a complex thought process, but they don't necessarily know how to use a more tentative language to build that. So then the feedback helps you do that, right? All right, now, I also want to address here the question of building trust, because I think Kiran initially asked this question of the fear of ideas getting stolen. Just want to get a sense here, do others also feel this, and could you share that? Do you have a fear of, how if you share your writing, it might get stolen, and why do you have that? Could you share that if possible?
So, Cheyenne, I would agree that yes, this was one of the fears in my most probably master's, end of master's MPhil. Time I was in PhD and almost finishing PhD, I realized that there are so many ideas of my own that I never get written and published.
Hmm.
Forget about other people taking bits and parts of my ideas and getting published based on that. So on a daily basis, there are so many ideas that come to us that never reach fruition, that we never really pursue further to come up with a paper or an op-ed or something substantial. So once we kind of become easy with our own thoughts, I guess, once we start thinking that whatever I'm doing is not really that earth shattering and it's everyday business, uh, I think that just takes the weight away from the ideas getting stolen. I guess we only can, we tend to suffer from that when we take ourselves too seriously. And as writers, we should stop taking ourselves too seriously. I think in academic writing, that's something that kind of is ingrained in us. Like that's also the anxiety now. When students start writing, they're constantly thinking of the final draft. They're constantly thinking that, and it's a really tough time trying to make them understand that write down your flow. Let the sentences come. Just keep writing. Maybe the argument will come at the end of 10 pages, and then that argument that comes at the end of 10 pages will become your introduction later on in an essay. Go back. But then the fact that the process is something that we don't emphasize enough. It's the finished, published products that we see and read makes us feel that, oh, great. So these are great ideas, grand ideas. And if they're stolen, then that's a bad thing. So, yeah. Okay. So that's what I felt about my ideas. Now I don't worry about them at all because I'm not getting published enough with my own ideas. So I guess other people have other work to do.
Okay. I think, Nirajana, could you explain what you said? That why is it that you feel conscious in some communities and other groups you don't? Like what constitutes the difference for you?
I think I am audible.
Yeah.
Okay, so in our again in our PhD group, I can share my ideas among the PhD batchmates because we were in our group we spoke about how we should build an ethical community. We had a specific class on that. So we all know that we are on the same page. At least for some time, we will have those ideas in mind. And I have also, as I have mentioned, we have given peer feedback and we have received peer feedback. So we have experienced all those. But in some other communities, like in especially some, I have experienced this, some people who are now trying for PhD or who are now writing their proposals, they sometimes say my idea is bad, but later I see that they are taking elements from my ideas. So I have become more conscious in sharing my ideas in those communities.
Okay. Yeah, I think we sort of couldn't hear the last part because of some network issue, but yeah, I got the gist of what you said. And I think just to put what you said in conversation with what Polomi said, right? That when okay, in a situation where you see that certain elements are being taken, you become a little conscious, a little awkward. I don't know what the last bit you said is, but sometimes this also makes you want to change what you're saying, right? Now this is interesting, but at the same time, what Polum is saying is that uh, none of us are doing anything really original, and we are all in this sort of very complex conversation, and perhaps we are inevitably just borrowing from each other, and often we are just building the same ideas but perhaps in different contexts, right? So that also shifts how you think about, let's say, the whole idea of that your text is being stolen, right? Now, I don't want to get into this sort of philosophical discourse of plagiarism because it's actually quite fascinating, and there are people on all sides of the spectrum. But today, I would say that if any of you're interested in reading up on plagiarism, I think the philosophical conversation is more about, okay, plagiarism is not necessarily intentional. Uh, in an academic context, we are all inevitably having this conversation where we are sort of borrowing from each other, and in fact, all work that we have is sort of historical and historically mediated. So it is not possible for us to have some sort of earth-shatteringly original idea. So then, having a sense of that, how do we build a conversation where we are respecting each other and sort of acknowledging each other's contribution? You know, now that is a sort of a much longer conversation, right? But I think that um, the problem is cultural. The problem where us this is a situation where we feel that, oh, our ideas may be stolen. And in fact, it's happened to me, when I was sort of in different departments. I would often hear people say something similar, don't sort of be very open with your writing because somebody or the other might steal it. And there's enough evidence of that happening also. But the problem is essentially cultural. We Given that we don't have systems of sort of peer feedback practice where through which we are building trust and a reflexive conversation, in the absence of that system, what we have is people fending for themselves, right? And people sort of necessarily being in sort of competitive relations where one has to kind of topple another or go ahead of another, and you are in a competition of ideas, right? And where the attitude itself is that, oh, we have to sound smart or say the most relevant thing, as opposed to actually building a thought, right? So there is no short-term solution to this. But the midterm or long-term solution is definitely, or at least would include, developing a peer feedback culture. Because it's only in systems where you've had much longer peer feedback cultures, right? And when we're talking about university settings where this has happened, for decades, right? We know that people don't necessarily feel this anxiety, right? Because people feel like this is the way we'll grow. We'll only grow by sort of exposing our sort of writing to others. But yes, there is discretion involved here, right? You are not necessarily sharing your writing with just about anybody. You may share it with your friend, yes. You may share it with a scholar from the same discipline, or you may share it with a writing community that's been established over a few, weeks or months or whatever, right? And I think, that sense of caution, I do think, is warranted often. Not just because your ideas will be stolen, but let's say I share my writing with a stranger, I will not get useful feedback, right? So I think that making an informed choice, as Nirajana is saying, is quite important, right? But the point I want to reinforce is that if we don't develop peer feedback sort of practices, and I know all of you are from different sort of institutional locations, if you keep developing sort of peer feedback practices, then it's going to have a long-term kind of outcome of building trust, right? And it's going to shift your attitude from thinking about whose idea is better and whose idea is more stealable, to let's say how do we build an idea, right? It just shifts the intention, right? All right, now let's sort of move to the next question. And the next question is about, how do peer conversations shape one's authorial voice? And I won't spend too much time with this, but I just wanted to again put it down. So just taking from what we were saying earlier, if we are inevitably borrowing from each other, right? If our voice is inflected with each other's voices, with voices of scholars that we are reading in our discipline, right? If all that we are acquiring in terms of thought and language is a product of schooling and college experience and conversations with other scholars, then what is our voice exactly? right? And I think that it is very difficult to make a case for a unique voice, right? But we can make a case for perhaps each voice having particular characteristics. To go back to what Jitendra was saying, right? So, that feeling of, oh, am I right or wrong? Sometimes this thought or this anxiety operates at the level of, you know, is my just voice too generic? Is my voice just blah, right? uh, is my am I saying anything new? you know and I used the word blah very deliberately. Just last year when I was doing the final feedback sessions with students, I was asking a question, that how would you evaluate this piece, and I would give them parameters to think with. Their first response was, blah. They would just make sounds, they were not even using words. And I would ask, why is the first response one of disgust, right? Why are you feeling, or of alienation, or feeling indifferent, that I don't want to even engage, what have I exactly written, this is not me at all, right? Or if it's me, I don't want this to be me, right? But I feel, again, this problem emerges because, to go back to something I said earlier, we don't have a very specific vocabulary for identifying features of writing and voice, right? So I think something that Alina was saying earlier about, for example, tone, right? What is the tone of your writing, right? So at a very basic level, is it passive or active? Is it assertive, or sort of maybe deliberative? uh, is it also, if you enter into more emotional registers, is it ironic, sarcastic, or is it very reassuring, constructive, right? There will be a tone which we have to get at. And often peer feedback practices sort of help with that, because on your own, you don't have that sort of, that ability to, or the tools often to gauge your writing. It is also useful to, I mean, if, let's say, often people will think that, oh, I'm not being assertive at all, right? I feel like I'm just writing in a very even tone. But somebody else will say that, oh, but you are compared to me, right? So a comparison with another voice also helps distinguish the kind of voice that you have. So first, can we think of specific parameters through which we identify voice? Two, a peer feedback sort of setting helps us compare with other voices and thus sort of identify what is not unique, but what are the dominant characteristics of my voice. But also, very importantly, um, through peer feedback, you initiate yourself into disciplinary register. What does that mean? I mean, one of the things that the essay also talks about is this, that, you know, through sort of a conversation, you are signaling to each other what is good writing, or what is desirable writing, or what is legitimate writing within the discipline you're part of, right? So let's say how you would write in anthropology would be different from how you're writing in, let's say, political studies, right? Um, or how you're writing in history, right? Now, the value systems often are different. What would be valued as inventive in anthropology, which would be, let's say, maybe some self-reflexive moment where there's a person who goes into the field and is thinking about their own emotional reactions, right? That may not be valued in history, right? In history, what might be valued is sort of more corroboration, uh, right, of the sort of the phenomena that you're looking at, right? So looking at more sources and putting them together, and even what quote unquote we'll call a more dry writing could be valued because of the rigor that it has methodologically, right? So these sort of different value systems is something you kind of learn through peer feedback practices, uh, especially when those peer feedback practices are happening within a disciplinary framework, right? Often, and sorry, Paulam, you want to say something?
No, I'll come back to it later. Finish it.
Yeah,
I have a point that I want.
yeah, because often, I mean, I did my field work in English departments in Delhi University, where I would ask, you know, what have you learned from English honors? If you had to put it down, like top three sort of learnings in terms of skill sets, in terms of perspectives, and people would be very confused by that question, right? And they'll say, I don't know. Right? It's something fuzzy in your head. Oh, I've learned to be critical, maybe. But, you haven't been able to identify specific disciplinary tools because that conversation hasn't been very explicit. Right? Polam, you wanted to, yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that when you say disciplinary requirements of a particular writing, here I guess the rubric also becomes very important of the particular assignment that we're doing. Like if we just take down not PhD writing or MPhil writing, where there's kind of a structure more or less kind of fixed in the discipline. When we're working with college students, or when I am a college student, right? So trying to understand what the rubric of my particular assignment is, or asking the teacher what the requirement of that assignment is, like what is the expectation of that assignment, having that discussion prior to even getting on board writing it, and making those as headers, as Alina said, like the required headers on which we should be kind of discussing the peer feedback also becomes very important, I guess, right? So starting from the rubric also becomes kind of a important and objective point of discussion, right? Because the rubric is there in place. You will be kind of marked on that certain parameters in your writing, right? So as teachers, it is important to share with students, and as students, it's important to understand it. Not just a rubric is there shared by the student, and we never go back to see what the internal divisions of the score are. If there's divisions of the score, there's a reason why the score has been divided that way, right? So the discussion about, like, we generally in critical writing, as we have like comprehension, development, we have mechanics, and we also have, what's the fourth one, which is invention of ideas, right? So if invention might not be part of the rubric at all, right? So knowing that beforehand and starting from there, if we can keep the headers there, I think that is a good start to build that space of objective beginning. And later on, obviously, things will keep falling back and there will be ups and downs. But that understanding the rubric becomes very important. And that guide to create that feedback sheet for the teacher as well as for peers, for each other.
Yeah.
Are we sticking to that rubric? Are we going back to what the assignment requirements are? Right? Yeah. So just an add-on.
And
Sorry.
I also think that, but just to add to that, I often feel that it's just not to make sense of the rubric, but sometimes as a peer group, if you examine the rubric and try to make sense of it, you may come up with certain additions to it, which are also useful, right? Each of us are making sense of the rubric in our own ways. Firstly, often we don't have rubrics. It's not that when we are giving an assignment, we are saying that, okay, these are the rubrics, these are the parameters on which you're judging. But once you have those parameters, if I do this exercise in class where I give a sample essay to students, and then I give the rubric and I demonstrate how you would kind of evaluate, and then I divide them into groups of 3 and I ask them to sort of evaluate and give grades, right? And I want them to also jot down what are the sort of confusions or questions they have as they're evaluating. So for example, when you're evaluating grammar, to what extent do you think about the person's sort of existing linguistic proficiency, what they have been exposed to, what weightage should you give it, and so on, right? And if you don't give it enough weightage, then what should you give weightage to? So instead of grammar, then students will say, okay, perhaps we can think about the clarity of the idea. Perhaps we can also, sometimes we don't have to judge at the level of a sentence, but try to see sort of phrases and see what the student is trying to say, right? So I feel like this becomes a rich meaning-making exercise for students, but also like when we are peers, this is also a very useful conversation to have. How are we evaluating our writing? Do we have some rubrics? What should they be? To what extent are they adhering to our existing disciplinary protocols? What are some additions or inventions that we would like to make? So those are also useful conversations. And the final thing about this point I want to make is, while I've talked about being initiated into disciplinary registers, working within specific disciplines, sometimes it's useful to have cross-disciplinary conversations too. And I think the reading that I shared had talked about students from different disciplines also giving each other feedback, right? Where, um, you know, we sort of learn from each other's meaning making practices or value systems, right? So to go back to the example of history and anthropology, there is something to be gained from writing that is perhaps a little more emotionally evocative versus writing that is perhaps more interested in corroborating sources, right? And I think that, or for example, for that matter, if let's say we set up I've been in literature departments, but I've always found it very useful to talk to social science students as a literature student, because I feel that, okay, there are certain methodological gaps that I have often in how I'm thinking. I'm not thinking of evidence in a much more rigorous way, right? But at the same time, sometimes I have a metaphoric understanding, right? I use metaphors to think about certain concepts. There's an essay by Clifford Geertz where he says that, the metaphor of the stage, right? The metaphor of the game, they're now used within the social studies as models, right? But where did they come from, right? These metaphors were also inventions that came from the humanities, right? So I think that's also a very interesting possibility that emerges when we do this cross-disciplinary peer feedback. Now, I want to move to the final two questions. Polumi, do we have 10 more minutes? Is that
Yeah, I think, but the session ends at 8:30 unless people are rushing and they want
okay?
questions. Is there any pressing question that you would like to ask Cheyenne? Or else we'll let Cheyenne speak.
Okay, so I'll just quickly take you, because I think we've been talking, about the various sort of aspects of peer feedback, but I just want to now demonstrate where it, I think, in a sense, comes together. Uh, you know, Especially when it comes to written feedback, what are some of the choices we can make? Now, okay, so I'll quickly sort of take you through the next sort of aspect, which is how do we develop and evaluate meaningful peer feedback practices? And and I think there are a few things that I would want to highlight here. One is, of course, in a peer feedback setting, what we really have to work on is listening, right? And I think that, we don't talk enough about it. We assume that we know that, what it takes for us to understand another person's writing and give feedback. But again, like, it is a practice that needs to develop. If we can begin from classroom settings, great. But if we are sort of starting it at sort of in terms of research collectives, it might be useful to have conversations on how we are listening and how we want to listen, right? Because without sort of good listening, you won't be able to necessarily attune yourself to another person's thought or voice, right? Um, Now, the last two things I want to talk about would be, what is the language in which you provide feedback, especially formal feedback, right? So developing a demonstrative, specific languages becomes useful, and sometimes suggesting alternatives becomes useful. So let me share my screen and just take you through. This is sort of student feedback, and I want to sort of show you different choices that I'm making. So this is the first sort of draft of a student assignment, which is on the broad sort of topic the student has chosen is study on inclusivity and decentralization of Indian school curriculum, but the title eventually changed. It was a little broad initially, but one kind of feedback, and this actually is much more time consuming, I suppose, this kind of feedback, because this kind of feedback is it's engaging argumentatively with the thought, right? So the student has written that the voices of all communities must be represented in the curriculum so that the students can relate to what they're studying, right? And here, of course, I'm providing sort of a much more argumentative, reflective feedback, which is longer. In speech, of course, it is faster to do, but in writing, this is a kind of feedback that will take time. But it becomes important because there is no other way to really point out the problems with argumentation, right? And you have to put out your thought also. But one of the choices I make is also to use a sentence like, I'm wondering if the problem needs to be presented in this way. I'm not saying this is what you need to do. I'm just saying, okay, I'm thinking of this argument. I'm wondering, if you need to present it this way, or do you think this is something you can do, right? So this is one kind of feedback, right? Then another kind of feedback is, I suppose, not, it's on the other end of the spectrum where I am just saying that, oh, you can break this sentence. Now, this feedback is meaningful to the student because over conversations it's been established that, okay, such long sentences are sometimes difficult to read. So when I'm saying you can break the sentence, the student immediately understands where it's coming from. But in a situation where that's not established, perhaps you might need to explain that also. That, okay, if you don't break the sentence, then I'm a little confused about, what the entire argument is, or is whatever. It's a little difficult to follow, or it feels a little clumsy, or whatever, right? Whatever you think is the problem. And often in this kind of a situation, you can, so the student then sort of, gave an alternative immediately in the comment, right? And then I have the choice to comment back on it if required, right? So this is another kind of feedback. Similar to this, where it's just a simple question, right? It can happen in verbal and written feedback where I just ask a question. So a student has used the phrase a lack of motivation, and I'm simply have the question lack of motivation for whom? And the student then clarifies sort of what that means. So sometimes you can have just immediate follow-up questions. This is not an argument. You just want to clarify the point for yourself, right? Then another kind of feedback, and here I also want to tell you about my thought process. So initially, I wrote something that was a bit on the surface, right? The idea is not clear, phrase and explain better. And often this is the kind of feedback that you're getting, and you don't know, and what Kiran was also saying initially, you don't know what to do with this feedback, right? Why is it not clear? How do I explain it better, right? And then, in fact, like I was on a call with the student, and we sort of then talked about it. And then I said, okay, there are, two claims, and you need to sort of actually explain these two claims, and they're not coming out very clearly. So either if you know like what your confusion is, you can immediately say that, okay, the idea is not clear, and these are the ideas that need to be clear. It can be more demonstrative. If not, sometimes that verbal feedback needs to happen. Out of that verbal conversation needs to happen for you to understand, and then you kind of update the feedback. So these are some of the choices that I have made. I'll stop share now, but this is just for you to kind of reflect on, and also now think about what are the kinds of practices you would want to develop, right? I do think that having demonstrative feedback, using precise language, giving examples, sometimes giving alternatives are useful, rather than saying things like, oh, this is unstructured, this is incoherent, but explaining in what ways is very useful. And the final question, if we have a little time, and this is for you to reflect on, taking account of everything we have discussed today, from the philosophical to the practical, then how do we build trust and foster care-driven feedback processes or practices within peer communities? So what are the things that you would like to build and do, right? So if we have maybe 5 minutes, we can take some responses. Yeah. And here I would really like some of you haven't talked to maybe say, what are the practices that you would like to build, and how do you think like sort of better practices can be developed? So yeah, Jitendra.
Yes, uh, suppose that I have read a lot of articles and during the research, but I do not understand which sentence where are they putting and where is not putting, because the sequence, lack of sequence. I do not know where because where is sentence is putting, and some sentence putting here and some sentence then these type of the content putting after the 2 and 3 paragraphs. This is the basic problem in my side, sir.
All right. Amita, Vani, Shayon, Adrija, any of you would like to suggest?
Shahan, would you like to take that question for Jitendra? And what do you think? I think he's asking for some method
Yeah, yeah.
that
I thought I'll
navigate
take
his
some
problem.
responses and
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, then respond.
Yeah. Shayan? He's not here? Shayan is here. Chan is otherwise very talkative, but he's not talking now.
Today I'm just listening.
May you tell what are the problems you
I
feel when
joined
you...
late now. I think 15 minutes late I joined.
So that's okay. But whatever you heard, if there are certain takeaways from this today's session, that could also be a conversation we can do. Things that resonated, things that you do, or things you did and you felt, okay, oh, acha, that's why this worked. Something that happens
Or even
most often.
questions that you have.
Yeah, questions that we haven't been able to address in this 1.5 hour session. Anything? No? Audrija? Amita? Why aren't you speaking? You're feeling intimidated? There's no reason to feel you intimidated. This is a very informal space.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, actually, I couldn't listen to the whole talk. I joined in between, and I could just listen to parts of that only. And one reason for joining this is that I follow the Facebook page of Aina. So see, like I am familiar with the kind of content and the kind of ideas that are shared through that page, and I follow it. And as a teacher, and it many times resonates the kind of issues that I am struggling with. Many time I face it, but I don't know like how to handle it. But I think about it, I talk to my friends with whom I can actually share certain thoughts. And also like when certain other questions related to writing was also being discussed, one thing I feel that like the my pace is I sometimes feel that like the semesters are short and lot many things coming, and the kind of work we are doing. So many time it seems like we are not able to think through the questions, or the situations that we confront, and what is required in that particular context is a different kind of output, time bound. So many time and many time, though we think about certain things, we have to put them aside and focus on a different kind of format, and we just need to get fit into that kind of a framework. And because of various other kind of sociological and political situations, continuously putting aside our kind of genuine responses to ourselves, maybe that is kind of that is kind of it become kind of mundane. Like we also start kind of internalize, or in order to fit into that particular system, in order to survive, continuously keeping these questions away. I feel that that makes my work monotonous too. Many a time I start not liking my work, but I am just doing it to meet an end. So that's what actually brought me here, and I am happy to be part of this. And like with respect to feedback and all, I was thinking, see, many a time I'm not able to give this kind of a feedback to students, because my class will comprise of some 150 students. So then I understand that I'm not I'm not able to give that much time. And like, so I what I again feel is that the overall condition out, or that's also affecting the way in which we are thinking, and we are performing our work. And again, this kind of competition, what kind of a competition is this, or what are we competing for? So obviously, like you need to produce this many papers, or you need to you need to give like the format of that. So in order to show your progress, like you need to fit into that a particular format. So when like as part of various assessment processes and all, this is what is continuously asked for. Every semester you have to do this, and like you have this target, and you have to meet the target. So I don't know, like many time I feel that I'm not able to many time meet the target. And I am not so like it's like I need somewhat, and it can be different, the pace for each individual can be different too. So so that is like again, that competition is also coming from, I guess, the way in which we are looking at the whole idea of education, and it's interconnected. If there is a recording, I will listen to the whole lecture, and also I would like to read the essay and be part of these discussions. Yes, kudos to Aina, because like many times it has become like like I discuss it with like one or two of my colleagues, and we find it interesting, and we also think about such situations, and what are so it's also kind of brainstorming. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Vani. I think I'll just respond to, some of the points that came up. What Jitendra sort of you said about, that's a specific kind of problem that you said you're struggling with, right? And I think it's a very good starting point to, first have a sense of what is it that you're struggling with. And in a peer feedback setting, right, it becomes useful to then list out these particular kind of issues that you want to work on, right? And you sometimes turn it into, let's say, a goal that as a peer group you want to get to, right? Because on your own it is difficult. So it becomes important to have other people to sort of help you just reflect on, okay, is my sequence of sentences not effective? Is there another way I can say it, right? But on your own, right, it is definitely a little more difficult. But one sort of useful thing to look at would be logic and logic of arguments, right? So to understand, okay, how is it that there is a premise, right, of an idea, and how that sort of is leading to a conclusion, right? Or you have a certain, as we call it, a proposition, right? A certain claim, right? A certain assertion, but that has reasons. So sometimes thinking in that structured way also helps you, right? So that could be another way to think about it. But the larger point I want to make is that once we list out the specific issue we have, let's try to bring it into the feedback group and try to sort of get, generate more discussion on it. With regard to, I think Adrija's question, is there any, are there any skills you can adopt to get better at writing? Of course, there are many, and I think that this writing community, Logos Lab, it's you're trying to kind of, through these talks, you are trying to talk about the different skills and perspectives. So there is no one answer to this, of course. There are multiple skills. You may want to look at, just as a resource, you can look at writing departments, writing centers, and they have created a lot of resources. There are lots of them available for free. So if you just Google, search on Google writing center resources, you're going to find a lot of university writing center resources. So that could be one way. But that feeling of anxiety, there again, like in a sense, that's what we have been talking about today, that there will be that feeling of anxiety because of the competitiveness, because of the hierarchies that, and of course, as Vani said, the time frames also that we're working within, right? We have to perform. without really relaxing and without really deliberating on our ideas. But a good start is just showing it to your friend, showing your writing to your friend, you know showing it to somebody you trust, somebody who you feel is not going to immediately judge you, and just discussing it, right? It may not be the most, let's say, qualified discussion with, lots of, all these parameters we were talking about, tone and argument, and you may not use all those parameters, but it will still be a discussion on your writing. You will look at your writing through another person's eyes, not just yours, and you will examine it, and that is one of the first steps to beginning to be comfortable, right? And you move from one friend to two friends, and then slowly, you start setting up circles. Unfortunately, and this, I would then conclude with the most structural point, because today's session has been on something more specific, peer feedback, right? And through that, we're discussing various other issues. But structurally, of course, in Indian university settings, except for a few maybe privileged institutions, we don't have the space for peer feedback. In that we haven't developed the culture. And even if we do develop the culture, this has happened. Like in JNU, for example, there are faculty members who will say that, oh, we want to set up a peer feedback system, but don't know how that will happen, right? So it's like somebody has to do it. Somebody has to do the work of setting up this culture, because on its own, it's not happening. It's not happening organically. And there are multiple sort of structural reasons for that. Some we have talked about, but let's say the kind of rush that we have. So as for a teacher, it becomes so much more difficult to give personalized feedback. But while sort of, I think structurally we have to demand sort of big changes, and that's sort of the long-term kind of solution. But I feel like even in more sort of bigger classrooms, is it possible to just talk about the tools of peer feedback? We may not be able to implement a peer feedback practice and make students maybe give peer feedback, and it's difficult for the teacher to give personalized feedback. But okay, there could be two tools that can be talked about, right? And these tools can be shared, right? That's a start. And I'm just thinking of very practical, simple starting points, because unless we develop a culture where peer feedback becomes much more easier, then we're going to keep struggling with this problem of never quite knowing what our academic writing is worth and how we value it and how we examine it. So yeah, so I guess that's the final thing I guess I will say today. And I hope everyone enjoyed or had sort of reflective points. And if you have any questions, you can always direct them to me over email. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that is all from who all are still here. Also, Shayan, I would like to just go back to Vani was saying, is that in large classrooms, it's really difficult for teachers to conduct that meticulous feedbacking process that you just showed us on that document. But this is also where peer feedback comes in. If we can share the tools of peer feedback with our students, we basically kind of empower them to build this community on their own, and kind of, obviously it takes a lot of careful handling in the beginning, so that because this is also, as we all discussed, this is a place where internalities come out, vulnerabilities are upfront, power dynamics comes into play, and all of these problems come to the surface. But the thing is, if over a period of time we are able to enable our students learn this process through buddy system or through a group system, as Alina was saying, groups of 3s or 4s, with people who they gel with overall. So I think that's also a way of empowering students as writers, isn't it? Like this taking the load on ourselves is sometimes too exhausting. We won't be able to do it. Like it's possible to do it with 25 students, with 150 students. It's impossible. Every draft with that meticulousness, as you just showed us. So I think peer feedback also is a way out of the structural problem. But again, as I said, there has to be a kind of a careful mediation of teaching or your students how to do that, right? And that will take time. Things will go wrong, as all things go.
No, I absolutely, and I'm definitely not cynical about the possibility of doing sort of peer feedback, even within large classrooms, but it is challenging, right? So I suppose what we can start with would be the simplest things that is not going to take up too much time and it's not going to disrupt, because even teachers are not necessarily trained or are not exposed to the discourse, of peer feedback. And teachers also have to take that extra effort to join such talks and, such conversations,
Exactly,
into
exactly.
the
Yes.
literature, above and beyond the content they have to teach and the hundreds of assignments they have to assess, right? So,
Exactly.
so one, and in that sense, another structural solution is also for sort of groups like this, to reach out to maybe universities and help teachers build the, toolkits, the tools
Exactly.
that
Exactly.
that they can then impart to students.
Exactly. And as teachers, we bring a lot of judgment into classrooms. It's not that we are, what to say, we are immune to judgments or making judgments or easy judgments. The thing that we are talking from a vantage point is, as you said, like self-reflection of where I start. That's a very big thing. And as teachers to kind of remove that bias right at the beginning is that I'm not going to say something and make my students do it because I'm a teacher. That's a very difficult thing. And with some classrooms, it will be really problematic if you don't keep that power with you. It will be unmanageable because Indian classrooms are not structured or as, what to say, the relationship between the teacher and the student is not as fully formed, or and there are problems. We get to hear of these problems happens in different colleges where students are threatening teachers with this, that. So there's a different kind of dynamics coming in altogether. Like the only way for a teacher to survive in a situation like that is to hold on to that power of the teacher, or else how do I survive that very violent space sometimes? So those are taking on to new other discussions altogether. But yeah, absolutely makes sense. And let's wrap up with what I gathered from this talk, actually. Something that I learned today is clarifying roles. I never did that in my class before. But maybe this is something that I would like to do more, and maybe sometime have a chat with you how you do go ahead with that. Because yes, the moment you said roles, in my mind, in the classroom that I'm teaching right now, I could clearly see certain students taking up certain roles in my mind about the different aspects of a writer. So there's a person who's very, very snooty with English and is like absolutely meticulous with the way. And the moment you tell that person that you're writing very long sentences, so much so that I'm breathless when I read it, the response the person will give me is, but it's grammatically correct. So to that extent, vis-a-vis, there are other people who are just kind of giving definitions and not forming ideas at all. So just at that level. So clarifying roles is something that I learned today, and maybe I'll have to discuss with you more about how you go about doing it and making groups or kind of play situations, like as in role playing, maybe, where you assign different roles to the students and you let let their strengths play on to each other. Maybe that's what I understood, but it might be different in the way you do it. Is reflecting on our own power dynamics when we walk into a classroom as a teacher, as well as in a peer group. When I'm engaging, it's not that like, just to be aware that I'm not reading someone because I need to correct the person. Reading something because most probably I'll also have a lot to learn from that person. So that, and in case I know that I'm reading someone's writing who does not come with the cultural capital or the social capital as I come from, being sensitive to that thing building that empathy in the classroom, that people connect at that level, which is again a very difficult thing to do in a class where you have a lot of heterogeneous community, heterogeneous students to do it. And next is asking questions and giving suggestions is something that we generally practice. And with prompts, this also works well. When we give a set of prompts for our peer feedback manual that we share after every first draft, I think that just prompts students to give suggestions or voice their opinions about what they understand or what they don't understand in a non-patronizing way. So that is something which I do, which got reinforced in today's discussion. So thanks for that. And something that I often do, but sometimes kind of it misses out, is trying to understand what the intention of the students was rather than what comes out. This is particularly important for people who are not very confident in the language they are communicating. So things that we did, however, I'm handicapped in the sense that I only have access to 2 or 3 languages, Indian languages. And coming from a multi-language country like us, I think if the person knows Hindi, it's very easy for us to ask, okay, what did you want to say? Tell me in your own mother tongue. Then we get the idea and then we help the student formulate it. But when it's not, there is no common language other than English between the teacher and the student or between different peer groups, then I think this problem kind of becomes, it escalates a little bit. So I would like to know, how can that be navigated? When I'm talking to a student who knows Bengali and I can't understand what the person is trying to say in English, there's a way I can ask, okay, what do you want to say? Tell me in your own language. Let me see if I can help you improve your idea. Hindi, maybe. Ohomia, to extend it a little bit. Or Uriya, just to say, like, broken somewhere close to Bengali. But then what beyond that? Like, how do you frame your points to understand the intention of the student? That's one question that I want to end today's discussion with, because this is where I personally struggle a lot. Do you have any tips for that?
I mean, it's a difficult sort of question, because again, I don't think there is an immediate solution to that, because I feel like practically, like what I do is, it would either be the English that you're able to speak in that context. If we don't share a language, then we have to attempt either English or another language. It could be Hindi that we can sort of share together. But in a context where we don't share a language, then it can happen at the level of a class discussion sometimes, or in sort of smaller groups where there could be another person who also speaks the language. But to do that effectively, you have to also establish that there is, it's not that not being able to sort of communicate in English, let's say, is somehow making you subordinate, or, without that context, people are not going to feel very comfortable also, because there is an existing judgment that's there already. So in classroom discussion, sometimes that has happened where, people, maybe peer groups, they've had an internal conversation, but one person has communicated the conversation of the group, right? So that could be one way in which it happens. So it is contextual, I suppose, and but practically, I suppose we have to attempt to communicate in a language that we share, even if we don't have proficiency in that language. But through that, at least there's something you can gauge, and you work from there, yeah.
And I also love the way you brought in listening at the center of peer feedback activities. Like, we talk about reading, writing, thinking. Listening is something that we often don't kind of pause on a lot. But to have the patience to listen, and to listen with intention, and to listen in the sense that to keep your judgments aside and listen is a very, very difficult activity in itself, as an everyday activity. And I guess like this is how writing makes us a better person. I think peer feedback also, if we kind of engage in that process. As a person, we emerge as a person who's more sensitive, more care-driven, conscious of what you say, when you say it, and how you say it, and also pause and wait and listen and talk only when you're asked to. So those dynamics of communication becomes very vital in the peer feedback system, right? Okay, Cheyenne, that's all. Thank you so much. There was so much to learn, and absolutely appreciate the way you brought all the ideas together. Thank you so much. Folks here, I hope we've answered all your questions and we're not leaving the session without seeing a question in the chat box. No, everybody says thank you for the session. Yes, so I'll pass it on to Cheyenne. Thank you, Cheyenne. And thank you, Kiran, for taking the lead in such a short notice. You're not well as well, but thank you so much. That's all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.